Losing belly fat has always been the main request of my clients over 40. And recently, you might have seen more attention being paid not just to the pinchable subcutaneous fat, but also to the kind around your organs, the visceral fat. I'm going to show you how to determine if visceral fat is a problem for you and the evidence-based way to lose that fat without restrictive diets or extreme workouts. Let's start by looking at why visceral fat is dangerous. Visceral fat isn't just sitting there pushing your belly out. It's metabolically active and it releases inflammatory molecules that can damage your blood vessels, increase insulin resistance, and raise your risk of heart disease and early death. Visceral fat is more common in people who are overweight or obese, but studies show that even at a normal body weight, people with excess visceral fat have a higher likelihood of developing type 2 diabetes and cardiovascular disease. The good news is visceral fat tends to shrink first when you make the right lifestyle changes. And that brings us to what actually drives visceral fat. With nutrition, sugar is usually a good place to start. Most of us are consuming too much sugar. But first I want to clarify that despite all the fear-mongering, sugar is not poison. You can have some sugar in a healthy fat loss plan. The dose makes the poison. And most people just have too much. Of course, not all sugar is the same either. Many healthy whole foods naturally contain sugar, but it's bundled in with fiber, vitamins, minerals, and phytonutrients. But excess added sugars are linked to visceral fat gain. For visceral fat, fructose is the one you hear the most about, but it's not as harmful on its own as you may have been led to believe. In some controlled feeding studies, when calories are matched, replacing starch or glucose with fructose can lead to slightly more fat stored viscerally and in the liver, even without total weight gain. Fructose is mainly metabolized in the liver, where it's converted into triglycerides, fat, and if too much of that is happening, it can lead to something called non-alcoholic fatty liver disease. A 2009 study found that people consuming high fructose beverages for 10 weeks gained slightly more visceral and liver fat than those who were consuming glucose-sweetened drinks, despite similar calorie intake. But this was a study of only 32 overweight and obese people, and the effect size was relatively small when calories were controlled. The majority of visceral fat gain from sugar actually comes from excess energy intake. Too many calories. Sugary foods, and particularly drinks, make it really easy to consume more calories without feeling full. Now, fruit has fructose. That's probably what you think of first. But fructose alone isn't inherently harmful. Fruit contains fiber, water, and lots of micronutrients, and it keeps you full on relatively few calories. And the amount of fructose is relatively small compared to the real troublemakers. Sweet drinks like Coke, Pepsi, Cola, Pop, fizzy drinks, soda pop, whatever you call it where you live. A whole cup of strawberries has about 3.8 grams of fructose. A can of Coke has about 23.4 grams of fructose, more than 6 times that amount. And strawberries have fiber and vitamin C and other nutrients. Fruit is not making you fat, and it's not something you need to avoid if you want to lose fat. Most of us don't eat enough, and people who eat fruit actually tend to have lower levels of visceral fat. Table sugar, which has both fructose and glucose, and high fructose corn syrup are the real problem for most people, because they're the most common in our diets. And no, it's not useful to swap those with honey, cane sugar, maple syrup, or agave syrup, or anything like that. They're still concentrated sources of sugar that make it harder to keep your calories under control. That's why Coke, switching from high fructose corn syrup to cane sugar, will make absolutely no difference to anyone's health. They're equally harmful. But remember that you don't need to eliminate sugar, including added sugar, completely. With fat loss and your health, it's the overall pattern of eating that matters. I like a little maple syrup in my matcha latte sometimes, adding some Canadian flavor to my warm drinks. And I do like ice cream and milk chocolate, which have added sugar. Small amounts aren't the problem. It's the total amount you consume over the course of the day or week. And most importantly, it's the amount of calories overall that you consume, because that's what really drives fat gain. There's often added sugar in cereal, sweetened yogurt, ketchup, barbecue sauces, granola bars, and of course, those sweet lattes. A small amount of ketchup or barbecue sauce is okay, but for most people, fruit juice isn't a good idea to have every day since it has all that sugar without the fiber and the filling effect of whole fruit. From a fat loss perspective, you're taking in calories easily that don't fill you up. Keep that in mind if you're doing a lot of smoothies, especially if you're getting them on the go. They can have a lot of sugar and calories too. But sugar is only part of the story. The types of fats you eat may also influence whether your body stores visceral fat. You want to choose monounsaturated fats and polyunsaturated fats over saturated fats. A controlled clinical trial from Sweden found that when people with abdominal obesity replaced part of their saturated fat intake with polyunsaturated fats, mainly sunflower oil, for only 10 weeks, they lost visceral and liver fat, even without changing total calories. And that's one of those scary seed oils you've heard about. Despite all the noise, polyunsaturated fats consistently show health benefits over saturated fat. Saturated fat tends to promote fat storage in the liver and abdomen, while unsaturated fats improve your metabolic health and blood lipids. More saturated fat leads to higher LDL levels, which are now causally linked to cardiovascular disease. I know that the carnivore diet is super popular right now, but it goes against everything we know about nutrition. That fiber is good, that vegetables, fruit, whole grain, and nuts improve health outcomes, and that you want to limit your intake of high saturated fat foods like bacon, sausages, butter, and fatty cuts of red meat. Yeah, there's protein in there. We're going to talk about that. Use olive oil, avocado, nuts, and fatty fish as your main fat sources. You definitely don't need to go low fat, but you want some moderation there. If you enjoy steak, go for leaner cuts like sirloin most of the time instead of ribeye. Once your fats and sugars are under control, one macronutrient becomes your biggest ally against visceral fat, and that's protein. Higher protein intake helps reduce visceral fat by controlling appetite, maintaining lean muscle, and slightly increasing your daily calorie burn. Research shows that people who increase protein while keeping calories moderate lose more visceral fat than those on low protein diets. Aim for 0.7 to 1 gram of protein per pound, 1.6 to 2.2 grams per kilo of body weight each day. You want to focus primarily on lean protein sources to keep the calories and the saturated fat down. I've got a free protein plan that gives you some ideal protein sources to include in every meal. You can download it at the link in the description. Here are some easy modifications you can make to reduce visceral fat with more protein, less saturated fat, and less sugar. Unsweetened Greek yogurt instead of sweetened yogurt. Lower fat, higher protein milk like Fairlife. Have lower fat versions of cheeses like cottage cheese, ricotta, mozzarella, feta, and cheddar more often. And higher fat varieties of those cheeses and things like brie and camembert in smaller servings and less often. Choose leaner cuts of steak like eye of round, top round, and sirloin. I don't actually eat beef or pork myself because they don't agree with my sensitive stomach, but I tell my clients who love it that it's okay to have it 2 to 3 times a week. Choose leaner ground meats. Ground turkey and chicken naturally have less saturated fat than ground beef, but you can also do an extra lean ground beef. Some people like using mustard as a condiment because it's low in sugar, super popular with fitness competitors. That's great if you like it, but small amounts of barbecue sauce aren't going to ruin your fat loss plan unless it's poured all over a large rack of ribs or chicken wings. So now that nutrition is covered, let's look at the role of exercise in helping you get rid of visceral fat. Fat loss on its own will reduce visceral fat, however you do it. All types of exercise are good for reducing visceral fat. Some studies seem to show that moderate to high intensity cardio and interval training are slightly better at targeting this type of fat. Catecholamines are produced with higher intensity work, and that helps mobilize the visceral fat. In one study, getting over 75% of your maximum heart rate during interval work targeted visceral fat slightly more than low-intensity cardio. But a review and meta-analysis in 2023 found that there really isn't any difference between HIIT and continuous aerobic training. For me, consistent physical activity is more important than worrying about the specific type. Do the type of cardio that works for you. The only difference is that you can do HIIT in a shorter period of time, and the fitter you are, the more intensely you can work. The same applies to strength training, which also reduces visceral fat. The reduction may not be as great as cardio, but when the two of them work together, they actually have a synergistic effect, which is why I recommend both for fat loss. 2 to 4 strength sessions a week and a minimum of 150 minutes of moderate intensity cardio or 75 minutes of vigorous intensity cardio a week. That's just the general health recommendation, by the way. That's an ideal plan to reduce visceral fat and stay lean and strong over 40. You're more prone to visceral fat as you get older. Bad sleep and too much stress can add to visceral fat, so you want to make those a priority. Hormonal changes can drive visceral fat accumulation starting in your 40s too. For men, decreasing testosterone levels are associated with an increase in visceral fat. For women, the decline in estrogen during perimenopause and menopause can start to shift fat storage from the hips and thighs to the belly area. That means more fat around the middle, including visceral fat. So how do you know whether visceral fat is a problem for you? When I used to work as a trainer in gyms over a decade ago, I sometimes measured my clients' belly fat with calipers, and many of the men in their 40s and 50s and 60s had a hard area underneath the belly fat I was pinching. That's the visceral fat. So if you feel that hard area, that's your visceral fat. A CT scan or MRI is the most accurate way of measuring your visceral fat, but that's not very practical. You can get an estimate by measuring your waist and hips. If your waist circumference is over 40 inches, 102 centimeters for men, or 35 inches, 88 centimeters for women, that's a sign that you may have too much visceral fat. The waist to hip ratio, your waist divided by your hips, can be a bit more specific. In men, a waist to hip ratio greater than 0.9, and in women, a waist to hip ratio greater than 0.85 increases the likelihood that you're carrying dangerous visceral fat and all those health risks. So by managing your calories, reducing added sugars and saturated fats, and staying active, you can start to get your visceral fat under control. Oh, remember to pick up the free protein plan in the description so you have an idea of how to plan your meals around lean protein to lose belly fat. Even small improvements in your nutrition and exercise can cause measurable drops in your belly fat within weeks. If you want the exact system that I use to do that with my clients over 40, watch the video here.